Brilliant. Take it away, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yes, as Mark says, not immediately a sort of a bestseller topic, is it? Tax paying, you know. As somebody once said, there is nothing certain in this life except death and taxes. But there you go. So yeah, Crediton features large in this one, but we're also talking about a range of books which will cover the whole of Devon. This is a series of volumes which are being published by Devon and Cornwall Records Society, DCRS, and we are coming up to volume 3 being published this year. It's going through all the parishes in Devon through which there are taxpayer records. Roughly half the parishes in the county have substantial existing taxpayer records from this range of dates. So the first volume here was published back in 2015, covering Abbots Kerswell to Beer and Seaton. Volume 2 came out in, I think, 2018, taking as far as Chudley. And then this year, by the end of 2022, we will have the third volume, which is what I'm kind of floating for you today, taking us to the end of the letter D. As you will see, that's 3 volumes. We've got as far as the letter D. It's taken us since 2015 to do that. It's going to take a while to get through the alphabet, so be glad, everyone who lives in Crediton. Okay, the books are written and edited by Todd Gray, who many of you will know. Todd has done an immense amount of work on the history of the county, and is very much involved still in Devon and Cornwall Record Society. And he is the editor and principal author for these things. I say principal author. I think I'm very chuffed actually that I'm the first person to have a guest slot in this series, in that the bit on Crediton, as we'll see in a minute, has been written by me. So just a little blurb for Devon and Cornwall Record Society. Its object is to promote the study of history in the southwest of England by publishing and transcribing original records. It's all about making records accessible, as we'll see in just a moment. The Society publishes a new volume each year. It comes free with your membership. Membership's currently £25 a year, but the books are also available to non-members. As I say, this series is a very long-term project. We will have future volumes. We will be working our way through the alphabet, but they are not currently calendared. The Society publishes 1 volume a year. If we did nothing but this, everything else would have had to be put on hold for a very long period of time. So we're kind of doing a new volume every few years. So 2 questions arise. What parish taxes are we talking about? I won't go into these in huge detail at the moment. We'll come into them in a bit more detail later. But we're talking about, if I start at the bottom, we're talking about tithes, and everybody knows, roughly speaking, what tithes are. But do we? We're looking at that. But there are a number of other things during this period which came and went. Church rates are things about raising money actually for doing work on the local church. So they were collected as and when needed in an individual parish. Poor rates became a very, very big feature during this period, 1500 to 1650. Clerk rates, vanishingly rare. This is about when they particularly needed to raise money for the parish clerk. Easter books is a weird one. I won't even mention that one at the moment. I'll come on to that. It's something I had never heard of before this series came out. And then military and martial rates, when money was needed for the army, for the military. You think of ship money and Charles I and all that stuff, you're getting close to it. And why do we choose these dates? Why 1500 to 1650? This is a period of massive, massive change. You're straddling the Reformation, so you've got the last few decades of the Catholic Church as the predominant church in England, and then going straight through that into a period where we go from Henry VIII becoming the head of the Catholic Church in England. His son Edward VI comes in, takes on a more stringent form of Protestantism, back to Catholicism under Mary Tudor, back to the C of E under Elizabeth, and we haven't even got to the end of the 16th century as yet. And then, of course, Elizabeth has got this sort of less extreme form of Protestantism, and the people who like the Edward VIII style break off into the various dissenter groups. So we have this continuing religious turmoil which affects local populations and local communities quite significantly. We're talking about a period in history in which there is a massive increase in documentation. Pre-1500, not a lot survives. I don't know if Brian can put a number on this, but pre-1500 documents are probably a very, very low percentage of your archive.
Well, yeah, in general terms, and really very little of this sort, as you will probably know, Tony, early or earlier taxes would tend to be the sort of thing you find in the National Archives.
Absolutely.
Race subsidies, etc.
Yeah. So it's the period when local taxation becomes, and local records more generally become much more available. So that's kind of why we started there. By the time you get to the Civil War, you've got a load of complications. I mean, first of all, in the Civil War itself, a lot of parish life was disrupted. There are loads of records which just weren't kept. And what made it even worse was, after the Civil War, a lot of the records which had been kept by the people who'd been put into those parishes, those parish churches, under the Commonwealth, those records were deemed to be illegitimate. They were deemed to be rubbish by a lot of the returning people under the Restoration, and they just destroyed them. So we have a massive sort of hiatus, if you like, round about the middle of the 17th century. So that gives you a sense of the period we're talking about. The volumes themselves, they are primarily transcriptions. So we've got original documents like this that we're working from here, which are handwritten records by individual parishes. There's just a tiny corner of one from Crediton, something called the Town Prebend in Crediton. These can contain enormous amounts of genealogical data. We have got the names of local inhabitants, sometimes connected with the places they lived in, the actual sort of farm, hamlet, whatever that they lived in. And we can tell an awful lot about shifting populations simply by the fact we've got these early records of the people who lived in particular locations. There's quite a lot of stuff about economic and social history that comes out of it. Anything with numerical data, you begin to get a sense of wealth and how that changed and how it was distributed. As ever, the mass of the population don't appear at all, because if you were poor, you didn't pay taxes because you didn't have enough money to pay taxes. There was nothing to tax you on. But we still have a big slice of local communities. The last thing you get from transcriptions is that you don't have to struggle with the paleography. Anybody who's ever tried reading 16th century handwriting will know that, yeah, you can learn how to read it, but you're always left with the vagaries of who wrote the stuff. And a lot of these parish records, a lot of these tax records, were written by the people who were going around and writing stuff up as they went, and they weren't always the best scribes. One of the scribes in Crediton wins Todd Gray's award as being the worst handwriting he's ever come across. And we'll see there's a little story attached to that a bit later on today. The way that these transcriptions work is I've just taken a little chunk here out of the Crediton one. This is in draft form at the moment. Some of this might actually change before you get to the final one. But what you can see here is within the tithing of Ewford, now known as Yeoford, we learn immediately that the River Yo was previously called the River Ewe. There you go. And many of you know there's a little place called Uton, U-T-O-N, but Ewford has become Yeoford in the meantime. And we've got a long list of people there who were paying their taxes in this particular year. Sometimes, even in a simple list like this, you get little details like John Lee is John Lee of Gunston, and we still have a farm, a little tiny hamlet called Gunstone around to this day. you get some amazing names, like there's people called Dick Leg. And there's Dick Leg cottages over in Colbrook, which I guess must be related to the same family. If you were going through Yeoford, you'd seen a sign talking about Warren's farm, and you've got the family of Warren there. That's just a very simple list, and there are loads and loads and loads of these. And of course, you always have the thing about being able to pick out family names which have continued over the years, and other families which the names have just disappeared. Some of the records give us a lot more detail. So this second one, from a later return, this is from Aller along the on the road between Creedy Park and New Buildings, and Aller was another of the tithings. So we get little tiny bits of granular detail in this. So there's a place here which is described as being void. It was empty. It had previously been held by Roger Preston, otherwise Budbrook. Lots of people had aliases in those days for their surnames, all sorts of different reasons. And then it was set again to Robert Davies. So you could, if you were looking at this particular location, you would be able to see the date, the year in which that property changed hands. You've got John Pope of Pidsley, known as Pidsley, yeah. You've got dead. The widow Hookway has clearly died just about the time that this was being collected. And the widow Hookway, otherwise Sharrells, but then it's been set again to William Charles, where you can guess. That is actually the variations. I say guess. I would guess that that's a variation on the same name. But you've got something to work from if you're a genealogist. Is the widow Hookway, was she previously known as Charles or whatever? You begin to get a sense of the amount of information that can come out of these long lists. But what we also do with these volumes is to include an introductory essay. It's not just a whole load of lists. There's an introductory essay within each volume which gives you some useful background information to the subject. Volume 1, I think it was launched with what is to my mind a bit of a masterpiece, where Todd set the scene by including a whole load of stuff about the way that parish administration worked during that period. And then he gave a summary of each of those following types of rates. So if we look at parish administration, I mean, this is I think this is great stuff. You'll have to tell me if I'm right. After 1830, the parishes became the principal channel through which local taxes were collected. And they were very much about local taxes for local expenditure originally. So this is Henry VIII, we're talking about before the Reformation here. There was this beginning of a sense of saying parishes exist within a slightly larger world, which is still primarily local. So there was an Act for the Maintenance of Bridges, which was passed in 1531. Very often, rivers and whatnot form the boundaries of parishes. If you had two parishes either side of a river, who was going to maintain the bridge? They'd fall out, they'd argue about it constantly. So there was an Act to say there will be a tax introduced for the maintenance of bridges, and it will be collected locally because it's local people who will benefit from it. Next year they had an Act for the building of county jails. We were hearing this morning, weren't we, about crime and punishment, and there was an establishment of jails at county level, and again, local people were going to be paying for it, so again, it was published locally. There was also one for the murdering of crows, but we won't go there. There was some strange little aberration going on there. Moving on to the period immediately after the Reformation, one of the first things to remember is that parish churches became state churches. They became part of the state, part of government, if you like. And parishes developed, particularly through the Elizabethan period, as the local embodiment of government. They were local government units. But there was no uniform pattern. There was nothing laid down to say this is how parishes will work across the country. And you can see coming through these various parish rates, little echoes of earlier traditions and local circumstances, how things varied from one parish to another. Crediton is a really notable example of this. We have this split between the borough, the West Town, broadly speaking, and the Canon Fee, roughly speaking, the East Town, acting as two separate communities. And in some respects, they are treated independently and separately when it comes to some of these rates. We have the embodiment of the establishment of the Corporation of 12 Governors, which exists to this day, which manage the local church. And as we'll see below, they became almost like a local government body during this period. So it's really through looking at these tax records, these rates, local rates, that we get a sense of how distinctive local parishes were, how different they were from one another. Why were they raising rates? One of the main reasons for this was to deal with the paid positions within the church. Clearly we have the clergy. We have massive changes in the clergy over this period as well, from having in Crediton a collegiate church with a clergy body of somewhere in excess of 20 people before the Reformation. Yes, 20 people. And after the Reformation, still you have a guy who was called the preacher minister, and a deputy for him again. And they were paid positions. You have a parish clerk. Parish clerks had been around for centuries, but they became increasingly important and had an increasing workload from 1538 onwards. Any family historians will know 1538, births, marriages and deaths started to be recorded. This was an imposition, this was a requirement on parishes, so we get all these wonderful records which come in during this period. And somebody had to be paid to do the work. At the bottom of that list you have the sexton. He was very much a jack of all trades. The sexton was responsible for digging the graves, for cleaning the church, doing a bit of DIY around the place. All the mucky jobs got given to the sexton. But again, he was a salaried member of the church, so money had to be raised to pay for that job. But there were also a load of unpaid positions. Then as now, there are people who give of their time to keep the parish going. One of the things which comes up through these different records for all the different parishes is that many of them have a group which is most frequently called the 8 men, but sometimes it's more or less than that. Sometimes it's the 4 men, the 6 men, the 10 men, the 12 men, depending on the size of the parish, depending on the complexity of what it is they've got to do. And in Crediton, as I mentioned before, we have this body of the 12 governors of the church. These unpaid positions, the 8 men or whatever, morphed over that period into something which became known as the parish vestry by the end of the 16th century. And by some later point beyond our range here, they became the parish councils. So they started out as religious bodies, but they started accruing all these additional civic responsibilities. Usually chosen from among the 8, 10, whatever men were church wardens. Church wardens exist to this day, usually 2 in each parish. They're looking after the fabric of the church and making sure that the equipment is available for the services. Also unpaid were these jobs down the bottom. These come more and more into focus as we're going through this increasing secular responsibility. They were all unpaid jobs. Mostly they were held a year at a time, and you quite often get instances of people trying to get out of doing them. It was held to be your responsibility, if you were part of this body, to take your turn in all these jobs. Way wardens were the people who looked after the maintenance of the local highways. Constables, parish constables, very much the sort of the forerunner of the police. That's a very broad way of putting it, but they were concerned with the maintenance of law and order. The overseers of the poor, who became increasingly important during this period, and receivers, people who were about managing the finances. All of them are unpaid positions, all of them voluntary roles within the local church. So that gives us a sense of that parish administration. And how is that going to be paid for? It was going to be paid for by church rates of one form and another. It was really important after the Reformation to replace some of the previous ways of financing local activity in the church by ways which were acceptable to Protestant sensibilities. Some of the older forms of income were, you might say, politically incorrect now. The Catholic Church before the Reformation had taken a lot of money from the sale of indulgences. If you gave money to the church, then the local vicar would say, okay, that's 5 years off your time in purgatory when you die. You give a bit more, maybe 10 years off purgatory when you die. I mean, it just seems so bizarre. It really seems so bizarre to our way of thinking. But it was a commonplace. It was a way of raising money for the church before the Reformation. Church ales, this was a very common thing whereby the church would have its own festivals, if you like, and say, what we're going to do, we're going to get everybody to give barley and what have you for making a whole load of beer. We're going to go over to the church house, the predecessor of the parish hall, if you like, and we're going to set up a load of stalls. We're going to sell this beer and a load of cakes, and everybody's going to have a jolly good time, get drunk and raise a load of money for the church. And you can imagine how the die-hard dissenting groups and the Protestants felt about church ales. It took a long time to wipe out church ales, I have to tell you. A lot of them carried through right through the 17th century. But they were, generally speaking, frowned on, and in most communities they were suppressed. And with it went a whole load of income. So they had to find a way of raising the income they needed for all these new responsibilities. Lovely little quote down at the bottom there from Arlington. So this is from volume 1. We are in Arlington. We are on the letter A here, and they just make the point here. Lovely 17th century spelling of reparations there. For our rate of reparations of the church, we have none certain, but we gather as our need requires. These were not rates which were levied every year. They said, if we need the money this year, we'll raise it. Next year, guys, you may not have to pay any of this particular rate, okay? And it was very much around setting that, if you like, in their annual budget to say, okay, what are we going to have to levy this coming year? Which is another reason why there aren't rates of all these kinds for all these parishes each year. They do vary according to need. Poor rates. Well, this is a huge subject in itself. Before the Reformation, again, there were a load of institutions which were specifically around the care of the poor. Most large communities would have some kind of institution there for looking after the poor. Generally termed a hospital. Dangerous term to use. You and I know what we mean by a hospital. It meant something rather different in this period of history. Think somewhere around the terminology hospital, hospitality, hospice. Probably some blend of those things. Something to do with healthcare, something to do with the care of the elderly. One or two of us, including me, would probably have been at the age where I would need a lot of support by that time of life. And would have been there as a religious foundation which would be giving charitable support to those in need. We all know about the dissolution of the monasteries. At the same time, they also dissolved a whole load of institutions like that. So the St. Lawrence Chapel and Hospital in Crediton, a building which you can still see up at the West End there, that's a whole other story, was taken down. It was no longer to be run as a hospital. And what was more important for the local people at the time, that had been financed by a massive estate. An estate of about 250 acres supported that hospital. Well, of course, when this became taken over by the church, taken over by the state decided where it was going to give those 250 acres. they weren't available for local administration any longer. They went to some private individual. Tithes originally had financed three things. They had financed the church, they had financed education, and they had financed the poor. Not in any great generous way, but they were around those three factors. The tithes were also completely messed up by the Reformation. So what comes in instead, we get some considerable increase during this period in the appearance of charitable bequests in wills. So rich people will typically, one of the very first things they mention in their will is they say, I leave £5 to the poor of Crediton, or whatever we're talking about. We also get almshouses. The building of almshouses starts big time during this period. They are not, you get a sense with some of them, they are not entirely altruistic. There's, if you go to Barnstable, there's, I think it's called Slee's Almshouses, which has still got a bit of script running along the front of the building saying, he that giveth to the poor lendeth to the Lord. I hope you're listening, God. I'm doing a really good thing here. You know, I've given some money. So you get that sense of how rich people were kind of saying, yeah, okay, you know, when I die, maybe I should leave something really useful for ordinary people, which would have been distributed through the church. But this stuff was not sufficient to fund the needs of local communities. So we had a new regime which was introduced, and introduced with a lot more sense of control. Control which was exercised through the local councils, through the local vestry in this period, and with a distinction which stays with us to this day, distinguishing between the deserving poor and the sturdy beggars. And woe betide you if you were classified as a sturdy beggar. You would be, not only would you be given no support, but you would be possibly whipped for your trouble. You might be thrown into the bridewell and be badly treated there. If you were deserving poor and classified as deserving poor, at least you would get some kind of payment. So poor rates had changed in their character during this period, and we also get a lot of information that comes out of local records to support that. Tithes, as I said, these are not as simple as you might think. Tithes were levied every year. Year in, year out, you were going to be assessed for tithes if you had any money, if you had any land in particular. And the principal types of tithes were divided between what we call predial tithes, which were levied on arable land, on woodland, and other field crops. So when I say arable, that's principally grain, if you like. But other field crops might include beans. Pulses were a massive, major source of people's diets. Might include things like apples, for example. Mixed tithes was a whole load of stuff. This was around the things which would come out of your farm on a regular basis, not just once a year when it came to harvest. So livestock, you would be taxed on the number of cows, the number of sheep, the number of pigs you had, but also on any meat that you were selling from them. And also dairy produce. They didn't drink much milk in those days, but they made and ate a lot of cheese. Wool from your sheep, big issue in an area like Devon where there was a big woolen industry. And garden produce. Garden produce here as distinct from other field crops. So stuff that was in a garden was rated separately from stuff grown in the field. Third type was privy tithes, which were levied on people's wages. Why have I drawn them like that? Because these in the box there were the great tithes, the rectorial tithes. So they went to, if you've got somebody called the rector, they went to the rector. And those went, the small tithes went to the vicar. This was where the big money was. This was where the odds and sods were. So you have a distinction there in the way that those tithes were distributed. So now we worked our way, and the last ones were traditionally, the small tithes for the vicar were traditionally collected at Easter. So that's a sense of all the different sorts of rates we've got. And that's what was covered in Volume 1. As you can tell by the fact that it's taken me this long to talk about it, an immense amount went into that first stuff. When I come on to Volume 2, the introductory essay there goes more onto what we can learn from the records, how people paid their money. In a lot of cases, you get stuff being paid in kind rather than in cash. So in some parishes, people paid in fleece, in some people paid in corn, and so on and so forth. Most are in cash, but not all. And again, at a very granular level of detail, lots and lots of information. We learned some stuff about early modern arithmetic, which I'll come on to if we've got enough time. Just let me say, you're counting in Roman numerals. You're counting in Roman numerals in a way which has got no sense of place value or the number 0. It's quite fun, but we'll get there if we've got time. And of course, from the records we can learn an awful lot about local people and local places. The introductory essay for this one also talks about how the records were identified, collected and preserved. Lots of these are at our big repositories, so the Devon Record Office, which Brian has been talking to us about today, Exeter Cathedral Archive, which still holds a load of local records. Shouldn't have done so, but there's this kind of rule, forgive me if I've misrepresented this, but where records were kept, that's where they stay. People don't want to hand them on to another one. So if they happen to be in the Cathedral Archive, that's where they stay. Plymouth Record Office clearly now acts as something separate in that part of the county. North Devon Athenaeum, a body set up, I think, in the 19th century, collecting records around Barnstable and that area. And lastly, along comes the Devon and Cornwall Records Society, which said, no, we don't collect records. What we try and do is to make them available. We produce these transcriptions for people to be able to use and access this kind of information. So that was Volume 2. Volume 3, which is the one which is coming out this year, which we've changed the focus of the introductory essay, because it was becoming obvious that we weren't going to be able to we weren't going to preface too many more volumes with generic stuff. So up came the idea of saying, look, we've got 3 urban areas within the bit of the alphabet covered in Volume 3, Collington, Crediton and Dartmouth. Why don't we do a little section on each of those communities, which can flesh out, if you like, the information from the transcriptions? And as I said earlier, I was dead chuffed to be asked if I'd do the one about Crediton. So let's just talk to you about 16th and 17th century Crediton. Amazingly, at the start of this period, it was one of the 50 largest towns in England. Can you believe that? I mean, it's just an astonishing thought, isn't it? It just about squeaks in, but it was there. This was about 2,500 people in the early 16th century, as best estimated. You've got no census at that time, but best estimated from the records that exist. It was a really important market town. It was, and before the establishment of Exeter's weekly markets in the 16th century, it was, I quote, the only market in these western parts for the sale of kerseys, wool and yarn. So in terms of the woolen industry, massively important. And it continued, although Exeter sucked most of this market activity away when it established those weekly markets, it continued to be a major manufacturing centre way into the 17th century and even beyond, with a particular speciality in spinning. The little map here, that's just a little clip from the map of 1598. It's a 19th century copy of a map of 1598. The area around the church there, just to give you a sense of...
Is a kersey the same as a jersey?
A kersey the same as it? No, it's not. It's a nasty rough woolen thing which you'd have had to wear as a jacket. Okay, it was superseded by serge, which was a much more comfortable and tightly woven fabric, which gave you a little bit more protection.
A bit like army
bit like the army and uniform material and your school uniform jacket, which you may have had, was a form of serge. Yeah, okay. That also varied over time. Forgive me if I don't go too much into the woolen industry, but it was a major factor in Crediton. Crediton, as we've already said, was not one town; it was two. The borough, the west town, and the Cannon Fee or the east town. How did that work? This is just a map which accompanies my article in there, which gives you a sense of how the borough, this area in, broadly speaking, brown, tan, I suppose I call it, is the borough, the Cannon Fee, the area in purple there. And I've superimposed that on a map, on a modern map, if you like. So everything apart from those two areas is as now, with the built-up area there in grey, roads, railway line, etc. So quite a small, tightly focused area, which you can still identify to this day. The top edge of that goes along People's Park Road, essentially, which was the package of the borough. The borough itself was part of the Manor of Crediton. The Manor of Crediton had been held since early medieval times by the Bishop of Exeter into the 16th century. It changed hands so many times. I haven't got time to go into that today. But one of the massive things that happened in Crediton was that in 1529, the Bishop of Exeter leased the market to 9 burgesses, whose names are over there. I won't expect you to commit those names to memory, but we'll come across them again in a minute. That market, as I say, was still part of the driver of the local economy at that time. The borough was the commercial centre of the town. Cannon Fee, the bit based around the church, we had this collegiate church before 1540, so there were 12 prebendaries, plus vicars choral. There had originally been 12 prebendaries and 12 vicars, but there were less vicars by this time, I'm pleased to say. The vicars were the guys who did the work, so the prebendaries took the money, vicars did the work, broadly. And they were supported by tithes from the whole parish, plus income from 12 prebends, 12 farms. Each of those farms existed to provide an income for each of those 12 prebendaries. And pre-1540, 1535 in fact, there was a thing called the Vanor Ecclesiasticus, which was a nationwide valuation done by Thomas Cromwell, if you've ever come across Thomas Cromwell, possibly through Wolf Hall, which most of us will know him from. He was the guy who was sort of early accountant, main man with the money, and he said to Henry VIII, you can make a lot of money out of this church, you know. Why don't we do a valuation of all the church property around the country? And this still exists, and it's in immense detail. And in 1535, the possessions of the collegiate church of Crediton amounted to £256 a year. It was bringing in an income of £256 a year, which all changed, as we'll see in a moment. But this is the focus of the Canon Fee in Crediton. Post-Reformation, that church, everything changed basically. The church was bought by the local community. It was going to be torn down, along with tearing down all the monasteries and that. But the local community said, "Excuse me, can we buy this off you, then?" And the agreement was made. Yes, you can. You run it as a parish church. You have to have a body of 12 governors who will manage that church on your behalf. And by the way, you'll still owe us some money every year. Those 12 governors, we know their names. We know that incidentally that 3 of them came from Sandford. Sandford was still part of Crediton at this time. So here we are, 9 of Crediton, and the last 3 are from Sandford. What you will notice is that the market burgesses of 1529, you get the guy who I always think was my non-ancestor, Gilbert Gale. I have no idea if I'm related to him. I suspect not. But Gilbert Gale appears in both lists. A Trowbridge appears in both lists. A Holcombe appears in both lists. And a Shilston appears in both lists. The big guys have it all sewn up between them, broadly speaking. Even in 20 years gap between the two. the 9 of the 12 governors of Crediton. Big overlap with the list of the market burgesses. The church income, which had been £256 a year in 1535, was now £67 a year. The state had taken the rest. As Henry VIII and co said, we're having that, guys. And even of that £67 a year, £9, 12 shillings and 10 halfpenny was still payable to the Crown every year. So something in the region of, I can't do that, son, something in the region of £58 a year instead of £256 a year. This is why, as I say, suddenly the church was having to find another way of raising lots of money, hence all these parish rates and what have you. What they left them with was the privy tithes, those tithes on wages, the tithes to pay the vicar, and rentals from the property. The church locally had some property which it could get rents from. Those prebends, those 12 farms, and all the other tithes had been granted to other people. The Crown had distributed that to others. If you were paying tithes, very often you were paying those tithes not to the church, you were paying it to somebody who got the right of having that money. This is why it became such a big issue with all those non-conformist groups in particular. In part, this was the response to this was to have a massive reduction in the clergy establishment. No longer were we going to have all those 12 prebendaries and all those vicars' hall. Post-1560, we're into Elizabeth I now, the local people petitioned, the 12 governors petitioned the Crown to say, we can't do everything we've got that we need to do with the money we've got. We need some additional income. And Elizabeth, only a year after she's come to the throne, she says, okay guys, you can have an extra £100 a year. What we'll give you the tithes from the former prebends and from the St Lawrence lands. If you remember them, that was the hospital which had been taken away, along with its tithes given to somebody else. The Crown said, no, you can have those tithes again now. But, you're going to have additional responsibilities. First of all, you're going to have to establish a grammar school. You have to build that. You're going to have to pay the master for that. You're going to give 4 free places to Queen Elizabeth's poor scholars, rather. And you're going to have to pay the clergy a bigger sum than before. So, hang on a minute, I've got an extra £100 a year, but I'm going to be able to, I'm going to be required to do a lot more stuff. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to pay me £100 a year in fee farm rent, says the master. But don't worry, guys. It's notionally £100 a year. You'll be able to screw more than that out of the local population. And they did. And by 1582, they were managing to get £250 a year out of that. Tithes were a movable feast, and all these other rates were a movable feast. It's remarkable how much they were able to exercise that local discretion. Again, back to this, how it varied from one parish to another. The 12 governors are a nice local example to Crediton of how this secular role of the parishes evolved during the late 16th century. They were set up to manage the affairs of the church, which, as I say, was in the east town, but they very soon started acting as the vestry, the proto-parish council, for the whole of the parish. And amongst these roles that they took on for the whole of the parish included this poor law administration that I talked about, this sense of the parish being primarily responsible for the care and payment of people who couldn't look after themselves. The constables and law and order, that stuff started being managed by the 12 governors. The 12 governors who are around today I think would be horrified to find that they had those responsibilities, but they did in this period in the late 16th century. And even when it comes to musters, Britain had no standing army in those days. It had a militia. The militia was regularly called out to muster. So the parish had to find people who would put on the parish armour, collect the local arquebus and the pikes and the bills and all those things. And this was organised through the 12 governors. And we can tell all this from their local accounts. And then we get these flaming prebends, which are, I say flaming prebends because they have muddied the history of Crediton massively. In the early 16th century, there were 12 prebends. Here they are listed down here. And here they are superimposed on a map of Crediton and Sandford. 16th century, Sandford was still part of the parish of Crediton. And you can see there's a whole clutch of them here. There's 7 of them there within what became the parish of Sandford. And then another 5 dotted around within Crediton. Okay? The reason I say this is that we have this constant muddying of the term prebends and tithes, which continues. Those were the prebends as they were in the early 16th century. Okay? This is one of the wonderful things which we've been able to do from this volume, is that there are 8 sets of accounts for Crediton, dating from 1549, and the latest being 1644. And one of the things which gave me a lot of work to do was to sort out the evolution of these different tithings within Crediton. Okay? I say tithings because sometimes they still get called prebends. There were no prebends. There were no prebends at all. The prebends have been done away with in the 1540s, but still they use this flaming terminology. What you'll see from this is it's part of my essay there, is about trying to get a handle on how these changed their names, how they sometimes grouped together over this period of time. Some of them are incomplete, so this 1549 collection, what happened in 1549, some of you will know there was the Western Rebellion, sometimes referred to as the Prayer Book Rebellion, which did a lot of damage in Crediton. And there was a collection made later that year within the town, and extending out as far as Rudge, which is up on the road out towards Whitstone, Yewford, and Woodland, to collect money for repairing the church. Presumably, we don't know the details, but presumably damage had been done to the church itself as a result of the Western Rebellion. Then we've got this Easter book. We talked about Easter books before. There are 2 of those, and this is collections of money. Notionally speaking, collections of money for the vicar. Crediton is very odd in this respect, in that it had a salaried vicar in this period of history. In most parishes where they had something called an Easter book, it was about collecting money which would then be given to the vicar as his annual income. In terms of Crediton, certainly when you've got this one, which is a complete set of all parts of the parish, it actually turns out to be just collecting a quarter of the annual tithes. Not quite sure why they called it an Easter book, but clearly they said, okay, look, we'll have a 1/4 collection, which is terms an Easter book, and probably was the money which was then put towards the vicar's income. But essentially, this is a decoding. Should you wish to ever do any research around this, a decoding when you're looking at all those lists of people in all the different tithings. This is the way of trying to work out which parts of the parish those were at those different dates.
Is Woodland Head?
Yeah, Woodland Head lies within Woodland. Woodland was a massive rural part. If you can think of the parish of Crediton, that part of it which lies south and west of Yewford. So once you go up the hill from Yewford, and out as far as the edge of Hittisley, was still Crediton parish, and that was the tithing of Woodland. There's a massive story to talk about Woodland another day. Another day. But yeah, that's Woodland Head is the one bit which retains that name to this day. We can also tell within this how those boundaries shifted. So within what I call the southern part of Crediton, the part of Crediton which didn't become Sandford, pool and town tithing merged as the town tithing from 1619 onwards. So you see there, in the 1619 one, a whole load of things actually changed their names at this stage. it was a kind of updating of how these different places were named. Rudge, which is Rudge Episcopi, is forever getting confused with a place called Rudge in Sandford. Rudge Episcopi is the one up on the hill towards Whitstone. I promise you, it is. I say that against the very famous O.J. Rachel, who said both things in turn. He got himself very confused as to which was which. It's that one. Stowford, old name, was renamed as Knoll, and everybody knows where Knoll is, I guess, on the road out towards Copplestone there. And from 1619 onwards, it also included previous separate one of Priestcombe. Newton down by Salmon Hutch there, was never actually a prebend. I won't go into that. But it became the name of a tithing from 1619 onwards. Woodland, as we've just noted, that big area of rural land, and Ewford, which became Yeoford. Those are the groupings within the smaller part of Crediton once Sandford was split off. Within Sandford, we had several former prebends stroke tithings which were subsumed into something which became known as Sandford. It was not a separate parish still at this date, but it became known as Sandford from 1619. Some of these names, if you know the area, will be familiar. These are the names of farms which still exist to this day: Alla, Carswell, Creedy, Cross, Hensville, West Sandford and Woolsgrove. And there was an extra complexity in that some of the properties which had previously been part of the tithings of Cross and Hensville lay within what was still Crediton, so they got merged into Ewford and Knoll. And that's basically the way that they, oh, there we are, let you see that. Woodland is that big chunk out there, south and west of Ewford. And the precise boundaries of each, I haven't attempted to draw because, frankly, they are debatable. Okay, we can get a sense of where they are by the listings of the names and some of the farms within them, but that gives you a sense of how, broadly speaking, the tithings were drawn in the early 17th century. I promised you a bit about, I've got just a few minutes left here, and this is a rather lovely story. I promised you a bit about the problems of paleography. I was listening to a talk, this is back in 12 months ago now. Todd was giving a talk on Zoom, which was included a bit about this volume. And he was talking about this guy with the dreadful handwriting. And he said, I'm honestly not sure what that surname is. It says Tuppence, John, possibly it says Lickley, possibly it says Bickley, I've really no idea. And I thought, crikey, little light bulb moment here. I was part of a paleography group at the university a couple of years ago, and they do a lot of stuff looking at church court records. There's a load of depositions which still exist. And one of these was the deposition, the witness statement, if you like, was a victim statement in this case, which had been given by a lady called Earth Bickley. And this is in Crediton. You might be forgiven, mightn't you, for the thinking, is that really a capital E? Or is it a K? I don't know. Until I look down here and think, oh no, my name, George Gale, Esquire, is back again. That's definitely the word Esquire, and that's how he does his capital E's. And down here, this examinant has got a capital E like that. So she's called Earth Bickley. When I went back to this, I thought, no, look here, this is Bickley, not Lickley. But I also find when I went back to this that she's Earth Bickley alias Thresher. Okay, now we've got a road in Crediton called Threshers, yeah. Obviously some connection between the two, don't know exactly what it is. But in another of the church rates account, we've got another person whose name had been mistaken, because he's Gilbert. Now that was originally written as Booble. This is more like a proper capital B, but what's that letter there? Is that a B? Is that a K? But he's alias Thresher. So I'm fairly confident, I can put it, if any fellow paleographers would agree with me, it's better to say fairly confident than I'm definite that. I'm fairly confident that this is Gilbert Bickley alias Thresher, Earth Bickley alias Thresher, and John Bickley, not Bickley. Isn't it nice when you can come across corroborative information like that? And you've got to hold your hands up and say, I can't tell you this for definite, but it seems very likely to me. And the lovely last thing about that is I was pondering around that name Earth. Whoever would give their child the name Earth? We know there's a St. Earth in Cornwall, but St. Earth was a male saint. But do you know this lady here? This is St. Urith, who is, apart from anything else, she's the patron saint of Chittlehampton. Who knew Chittlehampton had a patron saint? She was a Devon martyr, rather like St. Sidwell, one of the very few female martyrs who have been sort of given local sainthood. Here she is with the scythe which decapitated her, and she's weirdly carrying her own head in her arm. I don't know how that works. But anyway, she's St. Urith, and St. Urith was again was a kind of patron, I believe, of expectant mothers and young mothers, and her name was given to quite a lot, never a massive amount, but quite a lot of local women, pre-Reformation, and as we can see here, some post-Reformation as well. And there's one or two examples. There's an Urith copplestone right through into she's either 16th or 17th century. I think she's 17th century. So that was just rather a nice little sideline that you can get from these very repetitive, long lists of taxpayers. Suddenly a name becomes clear. A bit of extra information comes into focus when you've got material from different sources which you can draw together. If I've got 2 minutes, Mark, have I got 2 minutes?
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about, I'm going to pose you a couple of questions about 16th century arithmetic. Roman numerals, we all know them, don't we? We all know what MMXX11 is, don't we? 2022. So it's our current year to this day. So we've got a sense of how Roman numerals work. But what we may or may not realise is that if you ever did, I'm going to lose my audience now because loads of people are going to say, "Oh God, we're going to do sums. You're going back to school." Place value does not work. You know about place value, don't you? You know, if we were doing a sum in modern numerals, those two together wouldn't be 2, would they? They'd be 11, wouldn't they? Yeah. Place value doesn't work in Roman numerals. You just keep adding up the biggest number through to the smallest number, and there's no way of indicating 0. And at this time, of course, I look around my audience here. I'm going to be fairly safe in getting this. Most of you will be have been familiar with pounds, shillings, and pence. You talk to kids today, they go completely when it comes to saying, well, there were 12 pence in a shilling and there were 20 shillings in a pound. And by the way, there were 4 farthings in a penny. But all of these complexities made it very difficult for people to do sums in Roman numerals. So when you get these accounts, yeah, I mean, this is not the worst handwriting, I promise you, this is not the worst. When you get these accounts, not only will you get the sums down the side, but if you have an eagle-eyed person, as Mr. Todd Gray is, Dr. Todd Gray, I beg his pardon, you will also find funny little things in the margins. Now, it's not many people who would have noticed that little squiggle over there, but that squiggle, I kid you not, is actually that. And what the hell is that? Pardon my language. That is 13 shillings and 10 pence halfpenny. What? What? How on earth is that 13 shillings and 10 pence halfpenny? They used something which is basically a primitive form of abacus. Yeah? And the best way I can describe that is to show you this one here. So if you can imagine having an abacus which is set out as pounds, shillings, pence and farthings, and you've got 2 rows, you've got an upper row and a lower row, okay? These are multiples of units. These are individual units. anything here in the pounds column is worth £10, that's worth £5, that's 5 shillings, that's worth 10 shillings, 5 shillings, that's 5 pence, and all those down below are individual units, okay? £3, 2 shillings, etc. So if you look at that sum, you can actually find that you've got 2 £10, 1 £5, 1 10 shillings, 1 5 shillings, 1 5 pence, 3 £1, 2 1 shillings, 4 1 pence, and 3 quarter pence. So believe it or not, that's £28, 17 shillings, 9 pence, 3 farthings. Why did they bother? Why did they bother, you ask? You know, somebody had taken the trouble to draw a little tiny grid like that, if you remember, in the margin. Why had they bothered to do so? Well, just think of it like this. Oh, sorry, I'll skip it. I was going to give you the opportunity to do this. I'm going to let you off. Why did they bother? You come back. You've been out and you've been doing your collections, yeah. And you've gone around to all these little farms and all these little hamlets, and people have given you this whole load of coins, and you've written them down. This is a tally sheet from Crediton, including that little sum there, and where they've written down the amounts given by each person. You're going to have to give this to the receiver at the church, yeah? You're going to have to say, here's the money I've collected, and here's the list of donations. You're going to want to be fairly confident that the two balance, because otherwise you're going to have to shell out, aren't you? You're going to have to take out of your own pocket any amount that's fallen short. So when they came to collect at the end of the collections for the day, or whatever period we're talking about, what they clearly did, they've gone down this far, and they added up all of those sums in Roman numerals, and made a little note of it. And the best way of making a little note of it was to take what you'd drawn. I think you'd drawn it in the dust, which was the original form of abacus. A few little grids, count out some beans, or you'd use it on a scrap of paper. But probably you would have wanted to reuse it again. You would have had your temporary abacus, you'd have put your beans out on it. You heard of accountants being called bean counters? You now know how many beans make 5. Well, it's 1 above the line and 5 below, all right? There are lots of things in our language which tell us about using beans and abacuses. So you'd have had your little, probably just a sheet of paper with a few lines on it, and you'd have put your beans out, and you thought, well, before I do this sum again, I'm just going to make a note of what it added up to. And if it added up to the same amount as the coins I'd collected, that's fine. If it didn't add up to it, I'm just going to do that sum again to make absolutely sure. So in some of these we get that lovely little insight into how the guys doing the collections tallied their accounts at the end of the day. I just think that's lovely. I mean, I call me weird if you like, but I just think that's an amazing little insight into how people went about this business. So there you go. So there we go. We've reached the end. I hope that was of interest to you.
Yeah.